Hello and welcome to the Navel Gays, a podcast about autosexuality. My name is Tolly Botts. This is Aaron Terrell. And today we are going to be doing another reaction video because there's a lot of content coming out in the space of gender dysphoria. And this conversation in particular is from the new podcast called Dollcast. This is a Brianna Wu adventure, which means off the bat that I am skeptical of it. However, there are the other hosts of this show are interesting, thoughtful, measured people. And the question that we want to answer today is Dollcast actually based, despite Brianna Wu at the helm? And so where we're going to start just a few minutes into the episode here, we have Skylar talking. Skylar is a self-identified autogynephile. I first encountered Skylar on Benjamin Boyce's YouTube channel. And Skylar's someone who's really thoughtful. She's been following what we're doing here at the Navel Gays since we started. She'd be a great future guest potentially. She's also sort of interested in not necessarily rebranding, but like how we communicate the reality of autoheterosexuality, so that people can see themselves in it and so that it perhaps is less stigmatizing. So that's who's on the screen here. That's Skylar. And their guest on this episode is Colin Wright, who is an evolutionary biologist who most people watching this channel are probably already familiar with. Who was sort of canceled from his field for going against the sort of woke narrative on trans women are women and talking about the realities of sexual dimorphism in humans. So without further ado, we are going to watch and react to this episode. Aaron, anything to say?
Just that they kind of touch on a lot of stuff about like where where the trans discussion is heading and where kind of like, you know, battle lines are going to be drawn in the future and stuff. And we'll probably kind of do a little bit of diverging down that track as well on our own, and less so in reaction to them, just because, yeah, there's a bit more to say on that. No, I think that about covers what we're about ready to get into here.
All right, cool. Let's watch.
I think that's where I see a lot of red flags with the trans ideology stuff kind of going off the rails, is exactly when you start seeing that protection of, oh, we can't have any discussion on this. It's scary. It's not going to help. It's going to, attack our own side. And so that was really eye-opening to me when you shared that at the GenSpec conference. And I was grateful that at least, we're gaining some traction in the discussions from that perspective. And my hope is that we'll see more of a overlap or a mutuality in having those like conversations between, your perspective or like the perspective of biology, and then seeing like where that can intersect, people that maybe have an experience that seems a little bit, contradictory, or seems, it seems to put it at odds with some of those basic tenets.
Yeah. I mean, my main project has been trying to clarify the biology of sex on this issue, because that's what kind of got me out of my lab and posting on Twitter in the first place, is people saying wrong things about sex. And I feel like if we could all just get to a point where, as long as we're making sane noises about what the biology is, then we can actually talk about, other aspects of transitioning and things like that. I just view a lot of what's happening now as people basing transitioning on these, frankly, pseudoscientific ideas of, literally being able to change your sex through certain things. And I think a lot of people, especially, younger people, I know, talking to Chloe Cole and stuff, like they literally thought in their mind that they could change their sex literally. And so I just think this sort of being misinformed is where I'm trying to focus my efforts.
But Colin, this is where I think my political project differs from yours, respectfully, because and this is a critique I have of you. I've thought about this so much this week that I understand. Like, I have no delusions. I am a natal male that has taken a course of like alterations to my body to appear female when I'm in public. I have no illusions about that. But what I think the gender critical conversation, the gender critical crowd does, is I think they take that simple reality, which I actually don't think as many people are confused about as you do. I disagree that most people think this. And I think you hyper focus on one area of this to make a whole host of arguments. And let's also not pretend that they don't use that fact to talk about us and frame us as though we're these hostile rapist invaders trying to take over women. And I think if you're like taking one scientific point and saying this is the only scientific point, well, I could do that right back to you. In fact, trans people do this all the time. What they'll say is, look, we've got these self-reported studies over here that show that, transition helps alleviate gender dysphoria. And you can show that all day long. And the science is very, very clear on this, that this will give someone, like, at least in the short term, a self-reported answer on the survey. I could come back to that and say, what, you want to deny that this science is real? You want to pretend this doesn't exist? How dare you? I just want to be here and have a scientific conversation. I can show you research all day long that shows if you call a trans woman he and don't affirm her, that this is psychologically damaging. Why are you trying to pursue a false scientific agenda? So I think, like, the science, there's a broad array of facts that as public policy professionals, we have to look at, not just this one thing. And I also think it's not the entire point. The point is not, are trans women biological women? That's not the question. It's, do trans women deserve dignity and access to the public comments? Because so much of the public policy being argued, I have to be honest, is so shockingly similar to the segregationist policies I saw advocated by elected officials in Mississippi in the 90s when I was growing up. So I think.
Okay. I have a few comments just off the bat. Brianna's right that people can cherry pick their own studies all day and say, look, the science supports me, the science supports me. However, if you were to actually put these things up side by side and compare the strength of data from self-reported satisfaction, basically, in a limited time period after some type of transition intervention, and put that up against the evidence that we have for sex being dimorphic and binary and immutable, they're not the same thing. And so I feel like it was slightly bad faith, I guess, coming from Brianna, who is trying to position herself as the totally sane, rational, reasonable, moderate trans voice on this topic. She should know then that this is not like and like here. These are apples and oranges, really.
Yeah. I just get the impression that she is really uncomfortable when people start talking about the extreme differences between males and females, and this, drawing this false equivalency to basically, say it's not fair or whatever.
Yeah, and again, this idea of, like, this is reminiscent of the segregationist South in Mississippi. These are the types of histrionic arguments that, again, Brianna claims to be trying to fight against right now in creating this sort of sane center lane for trans activism. But this is, of course, nothing like the segregationist South. And I think that's, people would probably find that to be an offensive comparison, although, we shouldn't make our decisions about people's feelings and how offended they are. But this just contradicts what she said at the top of where we played, which is, I'm under no illusions. I know that I am a natal male who, took steps to try to approximate the opposite sex. And so
to
if
appear female in public. Yeah. I think it's really interesting that she said in public, because it's very clear that I wonder how much the sense of being female is really that deeply felt. If she specifically said to appear female in public, it could just been a slip, but I don't know. It seemed interesting to me to use that verbiage.
Yeah, I don't want to make too much of it, but I agree that stuck out. Like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Especially if this is something that she claims like she was dealing with since she was, 3 years old, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue.
I think I'm entirely happy to see the scientific argument. What I want to get to is the public policy discussion, which is where I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that's important. I tend to focus on the biological aspect, mainly because I think that it is sort of used as a premise for, everything seems to flow from that initial premise of sort of the sex spectrum and negating the sex binary. But I do agree that at some point, the real discussion is like, well, what do we do about it in public policy and things like that? That's where the sort of rubber meets the road. And this is where I like to distinguish between, biological sex, and clearly sex is also a legal category that we've placed around it. And so, how do these, how do we, correlate biological sex to legal sex, and maybe things like what counts as being a woman or a female for sake of sport. And I'm not necessarily under the impression that they should all be the same. even if there should be massive overlap between them all. I think there are interesting things around the edges of where we can say, where can exceptions be made? And I think those are areas we should talk about potentially. And I'm not going to claim I have all of the answers to, and just like here's a perfect thing. I think sometimes we have to sort of deal with a situation that's sort of like the best, the least bad situation, because I don't think there's necessarily a silver bullet solution to a lot of things, but I think some solutions or proposed solutions are better or worse than others. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about any of those things for sure.
I think that's a good point that I think maybe sometimes gets overlooked, or perhaps is really actually missing from the conversation right now, since so much of these views are really polarized. I'm of the opinion, Aaron, I'm sure you'll agree, that we need to go back to a time where gender does not trump sex legally, like Colin was talking about, sort of legal sex. But I also don't think that sex segregation is necessary in every facet of life. And in fact, it might not be necessary in many, right? There are these certain spaces that I think should be sex segregated. I was going to say protected, but I'm already like so nauseous about this language. Not that there are not actual, then I'll get accused of downplaying the risks. Not that they're not actual risks, obviously, right? But yeah, this isn't something that needs to be one or the other. You know, like it doesn't mean that if in college they're splitting the class up by men and women to do some you know, like there seems to me actually that there would be a lot of instances where it would be okay for a trans person to socialize with the sex that they are more comfortable with, that they are presenting as. And so I do think that we should be making space. We should be having that conversation. It's not the focus of what you and I are going to talk about here, but I do think that's an important conversation to have, because I don't think it needs to be all or nothing, and I don't really know how helpful that is.
It was really kind of interesting. One of the more interesting things that came up in this conversation, and it hadn't actually occurred to me before, which I'm kind of embarrassed by, but he makes a very, very good point that, yeah, there are some instances where sex, like where the separation based on sex is much more important than in other instances that are typically, separated by sex. And we should be having that conversation about which ones, do, trans people, can kind of blend in as their target sex, and which ones should be relegated to actual biological sex. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's, again, like with the third space, bathrooms and whatnot, it's going to be something that's going to be strongly pushed back against by trans activists. I think that is the one way in which Brianna is kind of separating herself out from the typical trans activist, is she's willing to concede certain elements where it's like, okay, we know we are not the same as actual women in these categories. And so that's, I do want to, appreciate that from her.
That's very generous. The only, just if I'm being honest, so far the only space that I've seen Brianna willing to cede is sports. And it's very easy to do that when you are a nerdy gamer, computer programmer, and not an athlete. That's true.
Yeah.
I'm with you. No, I hear you. And I do want to I don't want to be so dogmatic, and I don't want to engage in the purity testing that I resent on both sides of this. And I do want to give credit where credit's due, but it doesn't feel like an actual concession. It feels like her views are really based around what's convenient for her position.
Yeah, and I do think that is exactly where she's coming from. It's very self-focused, but it's still, with regard to the kind of AGP psychology that she's very susceptible to, like I have a chemical imbalance in my brain and I can't function on testosterone. Like, she does this whole trans medical thing, like she is somehow really biologically female. And I think for people who cling to that, conceding that there is
anything.
Yeah, there is a significant physical difference between males and females, and males, including herself, should not be participating in women's sports. And no, that doesn't impact her directly because she's not, playing sports, but still just just psychologically acknowledging and admitting that is something, let's say.
Yeah.
It's letting that one thing,
No, fair. I would like to believe that you're right, and hopefully you are. To me, it's like I don't even know if this actually constitutes a real concession as much as like a political maneuver, and sort of seeing like, okay, this is the one thing that, Americans, even Democrats, really don't support. And so this is, maybe you're correct. Maybe there is some like hole poking at the AGP psychology going on here, but I don't know. And also, like, a lot of AGPs who deny AGP make up the based transsexual space. So there's actually a decent amount of autogynephiles who are willing to say, like, I'm a male.
Yeah.
And again, and I do appreciate that contribution to the conversation. It's complicated. It's really complicated. And I don't want the message to get lost, from the messenger and their. Okay, sorry.
But I'll just say that is about as based as Brianna Wu gets. So
yeah,
don't expect more.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw her. Sorry, I'll just say this one last thing, then I'll go again on this idea that I think it really is just about like what concessions can I make that won't influence the way that I get to live my life as a woman, in scare quotes, at all. Because I just saw her on Twitter. It was either today or yesterday, responding to someone saying like, most people don't hate trans people. Like they just, women don't want to have to come across a penis in the women's restroom. And Brianna's response was like, yes, I completely agree with you. Half of this panel has a penis. And this is where, I think she really is a hypocrite. And this is why, like, I differ from some of even our friends in this space, Aaron. Like, I don't think it's entirely about the penis, because whether someone has SRS is not necessarily linked to how much of a risk they're going to be, how much of a disturbance they're going to be. Because really, we're talking about disturbance here, not necessarily even like risk for discomfort. When people are saying they don't want to have to see a penis and stuff like this, or they don't want to, have to see like a clocky person walk in. But my point here was just that, like, Brianna will say in this panel that she has respect for these women, and she'll make comments like, oh, I can't possibly understand it, but like, yes, you guys are just normal women like me too. Okay, so do you want these normal women just like you to not be able to go into the bathroom because they have an SRS? And then this gets into the complicated bathroom question, which maybe you and I will tackle as they get deeper into this conversation. But I think it's hypocrisy. I think she just says what is convenient for her situation politically. And I think she would happily throw these people under the bus. If the new regulation was going to be, you need proof of SRS, which again will never be able to be policed in any meaningful way without the genital checks that no one actually wants to do, right? I think she would be completely fine throwing Taftaj. I don't know how to say her name. I'm probably going to screw it up a few times here, but I think she'd be fine throwing Skylar and Taff under the bus if it meant that she could continue using women's spaces, when Skylar and Taff pass much better than Brianna does, and they are much less likely to disturb women in their private space. Women are much less likely to detect them in their private space. So it's just, that's what I mean by it doesn't come down to the penis always, really.
No, it doesn't at all. That's an argument that I keep pushing back on, this whole like post SRS trans women should be in the women's room. Okay, I used the women's bathroom until I was about 27, 28 years old, and I have used the men's room the rest of my adult life, so the last 12, 13 years. I have never seen genitalia in any bathroom, either the men's bathroom or the women's bathroom. It's not something that you see, like, and it's not, and also like the post SRS argument seems to be less so that, oh, women might catch a glimpse of a penis. Again, that's not going to happen. They're all stalled, but I think what people are mostly saying is if they've had SRS, then they're not a threat to women. But most trans women who have not had SRS are also not a threat to women. They're not, just because they have a penis, they're not going to attack people. You know, it's like nobody's going. Virtually no one is going to go into a bathroom with the intention of sexually assaulting people, and you don't know what genitals somebody has in that bathroom. But like you pointed out, if a woman is in a bathroom and a 6'4" tower of that's a very different thing than, again, looking at Skylar, looking at Taff. Neither of them are going to trigger anything. I mean, they could obviously come across different in person, but most women, I suspect, are just going to read another woman and not go like, oof. You know, there's not going to be any kind of hesitation or red flags that go up subconsciously. Whereas, again, 6'4", facial reconstruction surgery times I don't know how many, like, regardless of not having a penis, she's going to make people uncomfortable, going to make women and girls uncomfortable.
Aaron, that is such an obvious point that I also didn't think about explicitly until right now. I've never seen someone else's genitals in the bathroom.
Right.
Ever. Even in the cases where, like, oh, the door wasn't properly closed and someone pushes it open, you still don't end up seeing genitals. Yeah.
Right.
That's a great point. And it does play into what I was already trying to say, but I hadn't thought about it in such explicit terms. It really is a good point. But yeah, if anything, it really is about, if you're clockable, you're causing a disturbance. Now, we as a society might say that, well, this is a disturbance that people need to learn to cope with, you know, like that might be where this goes. But really, it's about if you're clockable. It's not about if you have a penis or not, especially if most of these people wouldn't be able to use their penis in that way if they're, you know, on HRT or whatever. And another problem is we have no way of policing this, of checking to make sure. And I'm not comfortable incentivizing extremely intensive genital surgery so that people can be real 24/7 trans women. You know what I mean? Like, if that's what's going to be the one thing giving them, we shouldn't be giving people access based on how many surgeries they have.
Right.
Especially if people's goal is to, like, minimize medicalization except for where informed and sort of last resort, basically. Then we shouldn't be incentivizing it by saying, well, if you do invert your penis, you can use all of the women's facilities. Right. And it misses the point of, like, Roxy Tickle had SRS.
Right.
And back to my point, Skylar and Taftaj going into the women's room are going to cause way less problems, and they are non-operative, than Roxy Tickle walking into the women's room. And Roxy Tickle can't rape me. And still, I'm going to immediately say, oh. And you know what? That doesn't really, it doesn't affect me that much. I've gone into the women's room with trans women that I know. And I've done it pre-peaking and post-peaking. And post-peaking, all I think about is just, like, the fact that I think differently about this. I still had no fear. I still had no fear. And I'm not trying to say that other people shouldn't have fear, or that it's not warranted, and that it's not evolutionary, right, to sort of, like, for females to be able to spot males. But yeah, it's like, I'm not, it doesn't inherently scare me, but the only time it's a disturbance is if you can tell the person is male. It really has nothing to do with their genitals at that point. If we're talking about restrooms specifically, locker rooms are a different story. But yeah, I think that's a really, people don't, everyone's kind of hypocritical in how they talk about this, because, like, even like the Nancy Maces, you know, it's like, I don't want someone with a penis, or the, you know, if they have a penis, they're a man. Okay, Nancy, and if they don't have a penis, then are you welcoming them in? Like, you're not being consistent. And I think that's where, like, I've come is, like, my views on this now don't really please anyone, because I'm trying to be consistent. And I'm trying to think, like, all the way through how you can actually, like, what makes sense, what is fair, and how can you actually, like, reasonably manage or monitor this. Yeah. And I think
Yep.
most people who cling on to the, like, it's the penis thing and it's this rape instrument that we need to be afraid of, those same people probably would not be okay with I know they're not okay with Brianna Wu going into their bathroom, and Brianna Wu doesn't have a penis. So that's not actually the problem here, right?
No. No.
Yeah.
It does go back to what Colin was saying there in the beginning, though. It's like certain things, we should have a different approach depending on what it is. And yeah, I think passability is key when it comes to using the bathrooms. Somebody wrote on Twitter, like, if you need to feel that you need to show proof that you're allowed in the women's bathroom, you should not be there. Like, if it comes to that, where you feel that you need to prove you belong there, you don't belong there. But yeah, if you really reasonably pass, you're not going to, make other people uncomfortable. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of males especially do have a bad reading on what other people are reading from them. But again, looking at Tav, looking at Skylar, I don't imagine, they're gonna raise any alarms in most women. And I think also more importantly, even girls, when you say about like not feeling fear when you encounter, a trans woman in a bathroom, what if it's you got like a 8-9-year-old little girl going in there by herself? She doesn't even maybe know what a trans person is, and it's like, this is clearly a man,
right. And it comes down to if you can clocking their sex, right?
Right.
That's exactly what it comes down to, is can we clock this person's sex?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to locker rooms, I think that's not a case of passability. I think that should be a case of, that should be a third space, I think, actually, probably, because I obviously shouldn't be using the women's, but I feel like it's unethical to use the men's. And so, where a third one is available, I think people like Taf, Brianna, Skylar, myself, Buck, we shouldn't be going into spaces where, speaking of like myself and Buck or whatever, where men are completely undressing under the assumption that it is strictly men in that space, because there's an invasion of privacy that's happening there. Most men probably won't care, but there are plenty who would be really freaked out by knowing that there are or finding out there are females in that space. And I think just for privacy reasons, trans people should use a third space whenever possible. But with the bathrooms, again, it's just like, you're not looking at other people's genitals there. If you're not making other people, concerned by your presence, like Brianna naturally would, you use the one that makes the most social sense.
Yeah, and like you said, since most people are going to be bad at self-policing in this way, that's why I've come down to, my belief is that bathrooms should be sex segregated, and if you pass, you're going to pass, and it's not going to be an issue.
Right. Yeah.
And if you don't pass, it might be an issue.
Right.
Yeah. And I think we've also lost this idea of compromise. I think because trans rights have been framed so successfully as a civil rights issue, right? And not as a legal fiction and a social compromise, that there is no room for compromise, right? And it's like, well, if you want to be accepted in society as basically a man or basically a woman, then you give things up in that way too. And I know some people don't like to hear that, and it sounds really harsh, but I think that's kind of reasonable. Like, you won't be able to play professional competitive sports, right? Unless you play in your sex category, right? For the males. And you might not be able to use all public single sex facilities. That seems like a reasonable compromise.
There's just so many compromises just being an adult living in a society, but so much of trans ideology basically says that we're exempt from it somehow. Cake and eat it too kind of deal.
I think I have a very similar perspective on adult transition to you, but I think for minors, I think that a huge problem is just ability to actually conceptualize what they're doing and to properly consent to it. And to the extent that the studies kind of show null results, there are outliers within those studies who show positive results. So I think that there's maybe an opportunity for a rigorous gatekeeping process, something where medical professionals who are free from the political bias of, rubber stamping HRT prescriptions are allowed to truly interrogate, is this person a good candidate? And I don't know what age that might be, 16 is something that gets thrown around a lot as far as when that might be appropriate. That seems plausible to me. I wonder, you as the expert, all this stuff, the biology, if you think that's possible, or if you think it's just too fraught to potentially go down that road.
Yeah, it's really difficult because we can see that the existence of people who are adults and who've transitioned and who are happy with their transition and remain transitioned for their entire lives. I think a lot of people can say that, like, this person would have probably benefited if they could maybe pass more, if they had been able to transition at a younger age before they got these differences from puberty. I think that is a true statement. But the difficulty is that just because some of these people would have benefited, this sort of sets the stage for people to want to go back and say, like, well, how can we identify these people before puberty at a young age in order so we can make sure that we get those people. But the difficulty is that while it's easy to look back in hindsight to say that, like, oh, I'm somebody who would have benefited from this, it's really, really difficult and really, really inaccurate to have a pool of 11, 12-year-olds and be able to predict with really, really high accuracy which ones are going to be those ones that are happy with it through the rest of their lives.
Do you really think so, Colin? Because if you go look at the DSM standards, like, it's been lowered to 2 out of 6 criteria, 2 out of 6, which is just insane to me. And like, if you go read the standards from 1998, we'll put it in the show notes, it was such a higher standard. So I actually think, like, we do know a lot about what boys that want to be girls look like. Like, there are case studies about very typical transsexual like journey. And I do imagine that if you get the politics out of this, like, I do think there's a way to go and do really good studies and move back to these older standards and start, like, someone that has 2 out of 6 criteria, I do not support them transitioning as a minor. If someone's got 6 out of 6 and they're going through a major depressive episode and they have an eating disorder because they're trying to make themselves thin because they're terrified of, like, masculinizing, and, they've got suicidal ideation, I think symptomology, like, indicates treatment. And to me, that is a much stronger argument for intervention at that point.
Yeah, I mean,
something I want to highlight that is going to be obvious to you and I, Aaron, but maybe not to everyone watching, and it's going to play out a little in the rest, is this is a dynamic that we see more and more. The most zealous defenders or supporters of childhood transition are trans people who transitioned as adults. And
males who transitioned as adults.
Males. That's correct. Males who transitioned as adults. And you see that already here with Taft saying, like, the results basically show null results, and she leaves some room and says, even within these really underwhelming results, there are the outliers who show really positive results. So maybe there would be room to do, rigorous assessment. And I don't really know that I agree with that. And then Brianna jumps in and says, well, no, we just need to go back to what we were doing here at a time where we weren't transitioning children. And just the culture, yeah. Everything was different. Yeah. And so I just, like, I want that dichotomy to for people to just keep that in the back of their mind. Just observe the different ways that the adult transitioners and the child transitioners speak in this conversation. And really, I should limit that to Brianna versus Kelly and Taft, because Skylar speaks in a very measured way, even though Skylar transitioned when she was an adult. But so just pay attention to this, that the person pushing this the most is the person with no experience of childhood transition.
Good point.
Which is, like Colin said, which is how we got here. We got to childhood transition because there were these adults these adult males feeling dissatisfied with their outcomes. And yeah, lamenting. And for good reason. We want to help these people find them earlier so that they're going to suffer for a shorter period of time, and so that they will have better aesthetic outcomes, which is then supposed to increase their quality of life over the long run. But yeah, it's very interesting how different the perspectives are of the people who actually went through youth intervention and the person who wishes that she did. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it depends where we want to draw a line on, how much bycatch collateral damage are we willing to accept in here? How many kids are we willing to unnecessarily and wrongfully transition that would make them sterile in order to capture all the individuals who would receive a benefit? And how much is the harm that's done to those who are done wrongfully? How much is that harm offset by the benefits that is done by those who go through it and end up happy with it?
And then there's the opposite argument, like how many trans children becoming someone who cannot pass and are going to have really difficult lives what human cost of that is okay. How many trans children, like I went to rehab, I have no idea how I didn't die from all the drugs I took. How many kids with like a major depressive episode that commit suicide, like Leela Alcorn, how many of those kids were we willing to lose? And like, I think some of the framing I find so frustrating is where we always talk about like the cis children that may not get the perfect outcome that they want as the focus, and the trans lives are kind of talked about like they're disposable. And it feels really dehumanizing to me, if that makes sense.
Well, I feel like if anything, at least in the trans community, the focus is fully like on the trans kids.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like very rare for those detransitioners to even enter into the conversation. I do think within the medical profession, there's a very like natural lean or inclination towards not taking an intervention if you can potentially avoid that. And we're talking about like false positives and false negatives. I mean, if the doctor is going to prescribe HRT, they're taking on like a big responsibility, I think, ethically, for the results of that. And so if you do get these detransitioners, that seems to be really bad in a way that like, you know, adults, they can take on all of that moral, ethical responsibility, or at least most of it themselves. Yeah. And so with kids, it's a hugely different environment.
Do you not think like a huge piece?
Sorry, I appreciate Taff coming in there and saying, well, actually, I think the trans community is only focusing on these quote unquote truly trans kids, right? And ignoring the people who detransition and saying, well, they were just the cis people. And I think it's actually jarring the way that Brianna talks about it. Like, why are we so concerned about the cis kids who didn't get the perfect outcome they wanted?
Yeah. Yeah, this is where it's like she's just
the exact opposite, right? It's actually the trans adults who did not get the perfect outcome that they wanted. The cis kids, the regretters, the detransitioners, this is not, oh, they didn't get the result that they wanted. They made permanent, life-altering changes to their body. Now, not all of them regret it. Regret is complicated. Even when they detransition, right? Regret is complicated. Some people feel like it was part of their journey and that they're disappointed in the physical changes, but they feel like they wouldn't have been able to psychologically get to the point that they were at without the transition. Others wish they didn't lose 5, 6, 8, 10 years of their life, but they're okay with the physical changes. But this idea that we're spending too much time on the cis kids who don't get the outcome they want. It's just a complete inversion of the reality. It is the trans adults who don't have the cosmetic outcomes that they want who are pushing this. And I think, to be fair, not to Brianna so much, but to be fair to like some other people who I think share this position, a lot of them come from not necessarily wanting a better aesthetic result, which Brianna said explicitly. She said like they're not going to pass as well as adults. Brianna is fully focused on the aesthetics of looking like a real bona fide female because she's autogynephilic. Okay, but just put that to the side. There are other people in this space, including other autogynephiles who I speak to online, who support limited youth transition because they're concerned about the mental health of these young people. And they're concerned that if they don't transition, right, that we might be limiting the potential of some of these individuals. And while I still think that's more complicated, I have more respect for that position. Whereas I feel like Brianna is just so transparently concerned about cosmetic outcomes. Because I mean, that's the same. Even when she talks about it in with regards to the quote unquote cis kids, the cis kids who didn't get exactly the outcome that they wanted. Like, it's not all about cosmetics here. Like that's not what this is all about, and aesthetics here.
She's doing the exact same. I mean, she is a trans rights activist. That's what she is. Like, she's trying to do this whole, based branding, but she's just it's the same thing. The whole, if we, speaking like Colin, it's like, how do we know which kids are going to persist? She reframes that as being like, you don't care about trans kids. You just care about protecting cis kids, doing this really dichotomous, there's the trans kids and then the cis kids. And if you think that there's any sort of, that one could move into the other, it means you just care about cis kids, and, having more cis kids than, it's better to be cis, etc. Is what they're objecting to. But it is entirely it for her. It's being able to pass, being, an attractive, small, ish woman, etc. is what she laments not having. But it's extra frustrating because the point she's trying to make, and she'll be more explicit about it later on, is with males, like, once this desire to to live and pass as a woman has set in, it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And that's what she's saying, but she of course will not admit to or own autogynephilia. But
Right.
but if you do, then you kind of have an argument for that youth transition. I think it's pretty much always unethical, and not reasonable, not justifiable, etc. But there is a pragmatic and reasonable argument to be made for extremely dysphoric, 13, 14-year-old boys to be able to transition, because no, it's not going away. They're going to deal with that for the rest of their lives. And and it's because it's autogynephilia, but she won't explain that.
No, exactly. I think if anything, like autogynephilic gender dysphoria is a reason that we should not just abolish this for adults also, which again, when I first peaked and first got into this, I was very much in line with a lot of the detransitioner arguments, which is this is not safe for adults either, and I agree with them to a certain extent, which is like my whole spiel about informed consent. I think nearly no one, right? Nearly 0% of people going for this are getting honest, informed consent from their clinicians, from their doctors. But I think we need to, you can't put the cat back in the bag, and
right.
The technology exists. So even if they can't get it here, they're just going to go get it somewhere else. But I think autogynephilic gender dysphoria is a good reason to keep this option open for adults. The problem with children, like you said, even if I agree that you can be an autogynephilic adolescent. Like, I think that very much exists. I think that it describes the sort of ROGD boy cohort that we're seeing. Lots of autogynephiles that we know, the onset is with puberty, is with the onset of their sexuality, for some of them even younger. So do I think that these people are going to persist into the future? Very likely for many of them. Do I think that I don't think you can cure autogynephilia? Do I think like there are probably ways to integrate or moderate it? Sure. Yes, I do think that. I don't have any 10-step plan. I'm not guaranteeing that for anybody, but I do think that I've seen in people's lives that it seems like they're able to manage it in different ways. But even if all of these people are going to persist into adulthood, I don't think personally, where I come down, I don't think it's ethical, because no one can see into the future, even about themselves. And so even if they're always going to want to be a woman, that doesn't mean that they might change their mind about what type of interventions they want to have as adults. They might change their mind on wanting to retain their fertility. I know a lot of them don't, and so they resent this argument. But the point is, we shouldn't be foreclosing these options from people who can't comprehend. Who I don't think who can't necessarily fully comprehend. And even for the precocious ones, which I think many of these autogynephiles are, they're really smart. They're probably above average IQ and precocious in that way. Even if they can comprehend it, they can't see into the future. They don't know what other considerations they might want to make as adults. They don't know what type of interventions are going to be available. I think it's unethical to do this on somebody who is not even fully developed. When their body is not fully developed, their brain is not fully developed. I don't think it's ethical. But yeah, I'm with you. I do think this does represent the cohort that would be most appropriate to treat in adolescence, if there is a cohort to treat in adolescence.
Yep. Because testosterone is cumulative, and so I can fully empathize with and I see just emotionally, pragmatically why people are advocating for pediatric transition for, in my opinion, it should be exclusively autogynephilic males. There's zero argument to be made for females to transition before the age of 25, in my opinion, personally. I don't exactly understand the what's psychobiology or whatever behind it, about that whole brain maturation or whatever. But the difference between 18 and 25 in males, that's again a lot of the cumulative effects of testosterone. And so making it available for males at right at the age of 18, as early as possible. It's a whole different conversation. It goes back into that. In different instances, these things matter to different degrees. But the only way to make a reasonable and convincing argument for pediatric transition would be to accept, acknowledge, and discuss autogynephilia. And if Brianna chooses to do that, I will obviously have more respect for her, but I don't anticipate that happening.
Right. And again, like you and I have conversations with people who are self-identified autogynephiles who are pro youth intervention, and we can have those conversations because at least we're all just like living in reality and using the same words, right? And we mean the same things. Yeah, I think also something like, and it goes back to like, not even compromises in terms of like social and cultural compromises, but just kind of like compromises with the universe, for lack of better terms, is like, not everyone is beautiful. Not everyone is handsome. And this idea, like, I agree that being beautiful and being handsome is going to make your life a lot easier in many ways, is going to bring many advantages in many ways. I recognize that. I acknowledge that. That's not fair. Boohoo. Like, that is life. And especially when we put it in the framing of children, if we see a kid developing kind of ugly, like, we don't intervene. Like, so, you know, it's hard to be crass about that, but like, you know, oh, my little daughter, she's getting really hairy. Like, let's take her in for electrolysis and stuff like that, so that it's not harder for her when she's an adult and her hair is darker and thicker. It's like, we would think that's obscene to a certain extent to do and to put on children in that way. Adults can take steps to beautify themselves, right? And to varying levels of success. You know, not everyone can be a supermodel, even depending on like when they intervene in these ways. But the outcome shouldn't just be to be beautiful. And yes, a trans person's life is going to be potentially easier or better. Again, I don't think that beauty is everything, but easier in many ways if they're beautiful. And so is a non-trans person's life.
Well, okay, so I think when it comes to the auto-heterosexual component that we're talking about here, I think that is where, you know, being an attractive member of the opposite sex is the real appeal, right? Because it is tied to, you know, your sexuality. Just like you're going to want to get the most attractive spouse you can get, you want to be the most attractive version of the opposite sex you can be. So I think it is slightly different in that regards to just like, not everybody gets, you know, not everybody gets to be beautiful or whatever, but it's like, when you're specifically transitioning to be that which you are attracted to, being attractive is pretty important.
That is a good point. That is a very good point. There I used to just like rag on autogynephiles before I understood this as deeply as I did, but it's like they don't actually want to be women, they want to be hot women, you know. It's like, this is not real, you know. It's like, well, naturally, you know, they want to be what they're attracted to. And so no, that's a good point. I have more thoughts on that, but I need to formulate them better. That is a good point. That is why there is an extra emphasis, let's say, even though, again, you could argue everyone wants to be attractive, be more attractive. But yes, it's a good point that how the autogynephilic psychology plays into that. All right, so I'm gonna press play again. It looks like Kelly is just about to start speaking, and Kelly, like Taff, was a youth transitioner.
Piece of it might be how some of these therapists that, in my opinion, are extremely underqualified and barely have any experience, borderline don't even have a degree, are able to diagnose these kids with gender dysphoria, when I feel like it should be left up to probably more like psychiatrists and people that have a little more experience.
Yeah, well, I think the main issue is with the gender affirming model of care that is, you know, basically doesn't have these safeguards. It's essentially, you know, if the kid identifies as a certain way, then that's how they identify. There's not really a lot of pushback that can happen with respect to someone making these certain claims. And, you know, we do have an issue in the culture too, because we have, if you look at the medical community, it is, especially in trans medicine, it's filled with gender affirming practitioners. It's also in the culture, it's in the water, as you know, to whatever degree it can be called a social contagion, just adopting these trans identities because of the ideological shift that we've experienced. I think I really don't trust the community right now, given the state of the medical field and the state of the culture, to do a really good job assessing any type of kid to any reliable accuracy who is going to reliably, you know, remain transition for their whole life. And then there's also a philosophical issue of, it's impossible to do like the blind studies on this to know that like, okay, maybe this one person is transitioned and they remain transitioned and happy through their lives, but you can't see how happy they would have been if, say, they didn't, if they maybe would have desisted, because there is this sort of inertia that a social transition has, puberty blockers has, cross-sex hormones. They kind of lock people in, make it more difficult for people to desist. And so it's hard to control for that, to know that maybe they would have been happy either way. And, all else being equal, if they would have been happy without transitioning, well, now that at least they have their fertility in this other scenario too. So it's really difficult. I mean, it's so difficult with kids. That's why my personal view is that we shouldn't be doing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to adolescents, and it should be reserved for people who are 18 or older. But even
really,
they
you would completely ban it for all, even MTFs, even though they have a much lower issue rate.
I would have it for people who turn 18, and even when you're 18, you deserve to have actual assessments. It shouldn't just be gender affirming.
A total ban. You're for a total ban on this, 100%. No exceptions. Parents do not have the right to, they've got a child, major depressive episode, suicidal ideation, has been saying they want to be a girl since they're 3. They hit puberty. They're terrified. Their body is becoming like a linebacker. You want a total ban in that case.
For minors, I do. I don't think the evidence is in there that shows that this is a reliable, will reliably improve their life.
Think all the we've got Kelly and Taff here today. They seem pretty healthy.
I get what you said.
This is so good. This is so good, because I do think in many ways Brianna is using these other trans women. I don't want to insult these other women and like they're duped and they don't realize they're being used or anything like this. I think there would be good reason to take Brianna up on this offer anyway, because Brianna has a really big platform and these women have really interesting things to say. And they're just like cool, normal people who I would probably enjoy being friends with. But I love that Brianna is setting up like, well, really? Well, we have Taff and Kelly here who are both childhood transitions and they seem really happy. And listeners, they're not. Brianna's going to be sorely disappointed in how she set this up. And maybe again, as a credit to these women, they are not puppets who are going to just go along with whatever Brianna wants to say. And also just kudos to Colin. And I'm not surprised at all by this, but I wonder if Brianna was. He's unshakable. He's just not going to be manipulated by that. He is thinking logically and rationally, and he will not be moved by your emotions. And that doesn't mean that he's unfeeling or that he's unkind. But this like really, so just everyone, you would ban it all. You wouldn't let the parents have a say, and now she wants to go at now like,
depressive episodes, and suicidal ideation, and
right. And I love and he's like, yep, yes, that is what I believe. And I think like that type of emotional manipulation is very effective. That works for a lot of people. And it works. We're seeing it right now in the heterodox sphere, which has been frustrating me with Brianna kind of making the rounds on all of my favorite podcasts and media outlets. And these are well-meaning, sympathetic, liberal-minded people who aren't deep in the sexology and don't know really about whatever transsexualism and gender dysphoria ideology. And they hear this person telling this heartbreaking story, and they are sympathetic. And these are the people, like, this is where you get like the Jesse Singles who are like, well, yeah, no, we shouldn't totally rule it out, right? Like there are these excited, and they are sympathetic people to a fault, maybe, or like empathetic people to a fault, because you can't make policy, you can't make like medical procedure around threats of suicide, around emotional manipulation, around retroactive retellings of someone's history. So yeah, I'm already talking too much, but I just wanted to say really kudos to Colin for not falling for that at all. And I knew, again, obviously he wasn't going to fall for it, but he didn't even really entertain it. Me, someone like me with my woman brain, I would feel the need to do a lot of niceties before saying like, yes, I understand and I have compassion for this and that, because I do have compassion. And I know Colin does too, but it's really satisfying to see someone not feel the need to do all that throat clearing, to say, correct.
Yeah.
That is what I believe. Yes.
Yep. And then just goes on to further explain why he believes that.
Yes. In a sensible, compassionate way. Okay. So now Brianna brings in what she thinks are her token childhood transitioners, and let's see what they have to say about youth medical transition and suicidality.
Sometimes I think about, if I'm very happy with my transition and where I'm at in life. I don't see myself ever detransitioning, but I'd be lying if I didn't say, like, a piece of me sometimes thinks, wow, if I wasn't given testosterone blockers at 15, like, would I have grown out of it by the time I was 18? I don't know, probably not, in my opinion. But how much of that is because I was on those blockers and because I'm on estrogen now and because I'm post-op? Like, I don't know how my mind has been affected because of those things, even though I do feel like I have a very happy, successful life now. So yeah, but it's a catch-22 for me too, because then I also think, well, what if it didn't like go away and I still felt that way into my adulthood, and then I would have developed even more and I would have passed less. And unfortunately, it just kind of seems like in this society, the more you pass, the better you're treated, the more respect you get. And even now when I feel like I somewhat pass, I feel like I still get treated like shit and judged for how I look. So I can only imagine how much worse it would be if I had to develop more. So it just sucks because I don't really know what the answer is, because there's no like magical test to like tell if you're trans or not. And I really wish there was, because I feel like it would like solve so many of these issues.
Yeah, so I don't deny that there's individuals who do benefit in the long term. Like there's an issue with pointing to individuals and saying, well, what about this person? You would have told them they couldn't. It's like, well, if we're talking about like a medical protocol and what we do, we can't just base it on someone I know who would have benefited from it. There has to be good evidence of long term outcomes.
But it feels like there's a double standard that you're applying here, where a trans child is just acceptable losses, meat for the machine. Like, I feel like, I don't mean to be emotional, but it's really hard to hear the way people talk about us. Like, our lives don't matter. And I can point to 20 drugs right now that went through and got to market because there was a lot of money in there for a pharmaceutical company in bringing that to market, where the science showed the efficacy was not so great. Oh, the one for female arousal to increase that. It's a statistical blip. This is not a great drug. It's amazing it went to market. But we look at that and like we weigh those outcomes, like this is going to help more people than it hurts. And those drugs come to market. There are all kinds of things in medicine that have much more shaky efficacy than gender affirming medicine. So I feel like rather than going to this extremist solution that takes those options out of parents' hands, what I think the right solution is, I fully agree with you, Colin. WPATH getting radicalized in the last 10 years is the worst thing that has ever happened to my community. It is terrible. You're 100% right. There's a bunch of fringe leftists with crazy ideas. This expansion of giving surgery to people with non-binary, I've looked up and down for any justification that giving a biological male that thinks they're non-binary breast implants and a full beard and letting them go on estrogen, becoming this thing in the middle, leads to any good healthcare outcome, which our tax dollars pay for. I don't think the science exists, yet the DSM has been rewritten to encourage that. So it seems to me that rather than going to this government overreach solution, the answer lies in looking at those standards. I think WPATH should be the central like public policy battlefield.
Skylar's face.
Yeah.
Just right there before you paused it, she's like
yeah. No, and I love how like now she's a libertarian. Like, I don't think the government intervention and okay, that's really interesting. This idea that like other medications or medical interventions get approved with shaky efficacy, that gets balanced against the risks. So if there's a drug that is supposed to, I guess, stimulate female arousal, and like Brianna, I don't know what this drug is, like Brianna's saying, its efficacy is really low. Okay, well, what are the side effects? Is this drug going to make this person's clitoris grow into something that approximates a micropenis? Are these drugs going to, change the person's voice for the rest of their life? It's just like, it's just apples and oranges. These are obviously not the same fucking thing.
Yeah,
and
it's just more of her manipulation techniques.
Exactly. Very, very practiced. And again, we're talking about children. We're not talking about adult women who are trying to increase their libido, for their husbands. These are just not the same thing. And she's not considering, okay, yes, efficacy level is one thing that you look at. You also have to look at the side effects, the potential permanent outcomes, all of these things. And she just like tries to fit so much into one thing too, right? And like, oh yeah, and it's WPATH. We need to work on fixing WPATH, and
she really doesn't like those non-binary guys with the beards and the breasts, because they kind of delegitimize her claim to womanhood. If there's too many of these not so committed male
autogynephiles.
Right, yeah. Exactly. Yes.
Yes.
Then it really delegitimizes us true transsexuals, and a very, very valid claim to approximating the opposite sex.
Well, Aaron, this is exactly what I keep reiterating in my conversations with you. This is where I come. These are my exact thoughts about the AGP versus age gap. like you're not the truer transsexual, the AGP, you know, versus the one who doesn't want to go all the way. Like, right, it's like Brianna saying, oh, it's these non-binaries who want breasts but want to keep their beards and stuff, right? It's the people with maybe less severe autogynephilia or something, right, who are keeping you from getting what's rightfully yours. I think is a potentially similar dynamic to the lines that people are trying to draw between stereotypical autogynephilic profile and the AGAMP, the she-male transvestite profile, let's say.
Well, I don't think that again, like one is more legitimate or valid or whatever than the other. Where I come from is dysphoria versus chasing a fantasy, right? So if you're very like just chronically uncomfortable in your own skin, your anatomy feels, you know, vulgar and foreign, and it's this chronic source of discomfort that, you know, is, you know, in some cases, you know, diminishing your quality of life. I just think that's a different kettle of fish than I think it'd be super hot to have breasts, right? I think that's
that's totally
the difference I'm drawing is.
No, I agree. And I actually saw you post something on Twitter about that, like kind of making a distinction between like trans people and like dysphoric people, basically. And so I agree with you. I don't think those things are so rigid. And I think to a certain extent, it's almost like you might have the presence of the discomfort and the absence of the euphoria and the kick, right? For the other AGPs, right? Like more negative emotionality almost. And yeah, no, so I do agree with you. I just think it's easy to try to use that as to draw some distinction there. And I'm not saying that's what people are trying to do right now, and I didn't mean to derail. But yes, exactly. Brianna, the non-binaries who are getting breasts and keeping their beards are a different flavor of what Brianna refuses to name.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I do believe that she, you know, she probably has a very similar experience of gender dysphoria to myself. And, but she won't acknowledge, you know, she has to do this thing. And I think a lot of gender criticals do it too, or the more centrist ones, where it's like, there's the fetishists and then the dysphorics, and, you know,
yes, you're right. That's exactly what she's doing. Yeah.
Right. But it's still these are different outcomes or different degrees of the same psychological phenomena.
Right.
And she'd be more effective if she was willing to acknowledge what that phenomena is. But
yes. Yeah, totally.
I mean, from what I've seen, I don't think that there is really convincing evidence that we can reliably know which kids are going to have the long-term benefit of these interventions. So that's why I draw a line right there. And I do have one, I guess, area of pushback I would say is I personally tend to avoid, and this is a kind of a controversial area, but I've talked to Leor Sapir a lot about this. There's a tendency to use the word like trans kids and refer to these people as like something that they are. They're like, this is a trans kid, is something very distinct from a kid who isn't trans. And I tend to favor using the word trans or the modifier trans to mean, you know, someone who's actually taken steps to like transition, because I think this labeling kids really young as trans is sort of sets them apart from other kids, where I think, you know, they should they're flagged as, you know, potentially someone who will transition later in life. But it's impossible to know which of those kids will become that category of trans.
But don't you see how that argument then continues to people like me? Because then you've got TERF Twitter, which calls me a trans-identified male. I'm a natal male. That's just a fact. But I'm a trans woman. That's what trans women call ourselves. Like, the game here is to frame me as male, to demean me, and to push a public policy discussion where I'm segregated from society. So I don't have an issue with doing that with children. It's just like, you have to think about where the next step is, if that makes sense to you. But
there needs to be trans children so I can be valid.
Yeah.
That's literally what she said.
Yes. And again, she just like is so transparently, like, she just
me.
Yes, and she says whatever she needs to say to like try to get agreement and try to like get consensus from the other person. So she just said like, I'm okay with doing that for children, but are you okay with doing that for children? You just like tried to guilt Colin into changing his perspective because he was trying to do that to children, aka say that, right, there are no such thing as trans children, and we can flag people who might have this propensity and might have this likelihood and have these issues. And then again, just the extreme, like, if you don't allow children to transition, then you are trying to force me out of society.
Yes.
And I pause too. This is just, I'm being nitpicky at this point, but like, we need to just drop the whole natal sex language. I understand why auto heterosexuals do it, because it's like still more, it's like for the same reasons that I'll hear a lot of AGPs who I admire say like, I'm male, but calling myself a man is like too much to bear. It's like, she can't call herself male, but natal male. Okay, I was born male. Natal male is, to me, is really just the like more GC way of saying assigned male
AFAB.
at birth.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. And again, it's like, there's almost this idea like, yes, natal male. So I was born male, but now no, you are a male. And that's Colin's point, right? It's like, we need to get back to reality, to our language that is based in reality.
This is actually the first argument I had with, or not argument, but disagreement I'd say I had with Mike Bailey. It was on the Transparency podcast, and he's said like, you are both natal females, and I was like, just females, like there's nothing changed, like it's not like natal. It implies that that it has changed since your birth, and like you're saying, it's the same thing as the assigned kind of language. But yeah, it is. Yeah, she does specifically say natal male because it does give that, but somewhere between my birth separation. And now that changed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I'm a natal male, as if that is like, that's the DSD that she like seems to think she has in her brain. Right. It's like, I was born male, which was an accident.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
Yeah.
That I've corrected.
Right. Yeah. And I think we should all stop using this language. And again, it doesn't mean that people have to be, and then it's like, I say this, I want people to stop using the natal male and female language. And then I go into spaces on Twitter, and every time a trans woman comes onto the stage to speak, someone gets on mic and says, "You're a man." Like, okay, we also don't need to do that. You know what I mean? And while I do think that man and male are synonyms, or adult male is a synonym for man, and same with woman and female, there's no need to, if we're talking about the reality of sex, we don't then need to like poke people in the eye. It's like, so I resent that. And maybe I'm being too particular with the language that I want people to use, but I think we need to drop the natal sex thing, because that is really the exact same thing as the AFAB, AMAB language. And just get back to compassionate reality.
Yeah, I like that. Compassionate reality. Yes.
Yeah.
I want to come back to this. Like, I'd love an answer on this. Why to you? Like, let's say I'll be very generous and say it is 5 trans kids out of 100 regret it. It's not that, as best as I can tell, like male to female trans kids. The female to male, I want to get them just out of the cohort completely. Testosterone is so powerful, you can wait till later. But why is that 5 children who may regret it, which is a very high number, more important than the 95 that are going to feel like their lives are better? Because I think that number, if you reversed it, how many of those children are going to feel like their lives are worse from not transitioning? Like, why does one count? Why do trans lives not matter and the cis lives do? That's what I don't understand.
Well, I think all lives matter, but I don't think we have good data to suggest what the desistance rates actually are at the moment. I mean, we have so much loss to follow up from all the studies that are performed. If we had an accurate assessment, I think if we could have really clear data, and I know the Manhattan Institute has a lot of data that they've been able to purchase, and they're working through making as more accurate reports as we can possibly do on this, to find out what those rates are.
So, I would say it's 49 and 51. Okay, 49 kids desist and regret, 51 trans kids feel like it benefited them. Why in that scenario would the trans kids not matter and the cis kids would? That's what I don't understand.
Interpret a little bit of this. I think what I'm hearing, Colin, and like correct me if I'm hearing this incorrectly, it seems like right now we just don't have strong evidence for any meaningful positive effects within trans kids. So we've got like survey data. We've got some studies that are showing like very small effects that are beneficial. And so we're hearing this rhetoric, like even from Brianna Wu, where you're talking about like depressive episodes and suicide. We don't have evidence that like HRT lowers suicide risk in trans kids. We don't have that evidence. And we do have evidence that HRT causes sterilization and causes irreversible body changes. And all of that is very well understood, but the benefit is very, it's kind of nebulous. It's hard to pinpoint. And it's for so many methodological reasons. It seems like when you're given that opportunity, all these kids who maybe will benefit from transition, and then you're talking about like this large 49% like desistance rate, it seems like the responsibility of the medical provider is to not intervene and potentially make something worse. I don't know if that's like a fair assessment, Colin. Feel free to add on to that, but I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with the severity of the interventions. I mean, we're going to have, wrongfully sterilize, half of the people who are going through this. That's a major thing. These are totally irreversible. And while I understand that going through puberty for someone who's eventually going to, consistently identify as trans is also potentially irreversible. I mean, there are people who are trans who do pursue, certain surgeries and hormones that do change parts of their body. It's more difficult. I will admit, it's not that it's easy to be a trans woman and it's going to be an easy time and it's just as good at, trying to make cosmetic changes after the fact. Like that's clearly, it's really difficult. But I would say that if we're going to have some sort of intervention, we have to have pretty reliable evidence that this is going to be overwhelmingly beneficial rather than harmful. And permanent changes to children mixed with sterilization, that's just a really hard hump to get over to say, you say, yes, we should be doing this to kids. I mean, it's one of those situations that it's the least bad situation because, until we have a better idea of desistance rates and, if we could have a crystal ball where we could know which kids are never going to regret it from a very early age, that's something I'd be open to. I'd say, okay, if we can know for sure, but we can't. And right now we really have no really good idea of what the level of desistance rates, especially because of the ideological shift we've recently experienced.
It's incredible. Brianna actually just said something like really controversial, which is no one knows what the detransition rates actually are, right? Especially in the United States, we have almost no way of meaningfully tracking this. Detransition means different things to different people. So like it is very complicated to actually get these numbers. But Brianna put out the example. She starts with 5 and 95. She says, okay, fine. Even if it's 51 and 49, Brianna's okay with continuing on this intervention if 49% of these youth were bad candidates to change their minds, desist or detransition. That's incredible. That's not moderate. That's not reasonable.
I think she has to say that because she needs, there to be trans kids and cis kids, and one can't be more important than the other. Therefore, if it's even just 1 percentage point more, then it's yeah.
You're right. It has to be an inevitability, right? It needs to be this immutable characteristic and an inevitable characteristic inborn, which again, we think it is inborn to a certain extent, but not the way that she wants it to be.
Right.
But that is just pretty incredible to me that she is saying she would be okay with 49 out of every 100 youth who get this intervention changing their mind, as long as the 51 will have better aesthetic outcomes in the future. Because even when it's like with all the other things that she talks about, like, but the depressive episodes and the drug abuse and this and that, is that better? Yeah, I do think that I don't mean to be like to minimize it, but I do think that a couple of years of struggle in someone's life is preferable to irreversible interventions before they were of legal age to even consent that they regret. People like this goes back to sort of like anti-fragility and stuff. Like people, cis people also get depressed and get addicted to drugs and have hard periods in their lives. And trans people need to be particularly resilient, if this is the path that they're going to go down. So yeah, I do think it is preferable. I know it sounds harsh, but yes, I do think it's preferable for people who are going to go on to transition to suffer, not that I want them to suffer, but to struggle, right? Even seriously struggle for a certain period of time than for half of the people in this population of intervention to regret it with such severe, potentially permanent outcomes. I don't even really see how that's so controversial to say.
She went to rehab.
And she's the only person who went to rehab. Also, I forgot what it was. She went to like Tiger Woods rehab or something. She went to like a really, really bougie rehab, if I remember correctly. Not
nice.
That's
good for her.
It's neither here nor there. Yeah, exactly. But even this, like, yeah, it's just very sad. Like you went through all of this, and you're now a successful adult. Like I hesitate to say well-adjusted, but like you've made a life for yourself. You're married, you have a career, you have a home, you know, like a stable life. Obviously,
a passel of Porsches.
That too, yeah. So yeah, it's like this. It's not the end of the world. People go through difficult challenges and come out wiser in many ways, you know, like even if it leaves scars. It's just like this really is life. This really is life. And I just think it's detached from reality when very recently in human history, there were no interventions possible.
Right.
And so it's like, if trans people always existed, then trans people have been persevering and pushing through and getting through the struggle, you know, to live satisfying lives. So, yeah.
Would you admit that practically, pragmatically, let's say tomorrow you get your way, President Trump takes you up like you asked him to on Twitter to put you in charge of this policy, you enact a total ban on children transitioning. Would you acknowledge that the very first thing they are going to do is to go on, like, estrogens not difficult to synthesize, and anti-androgens, you're not going to get drug sniffing dogs to find anti-androgens. Like, you would admit that just like abortion and women going into back alleys, the first thing that's going to happen is those kids are going to turn to Dr. Fortune. And they're going to start getting their healthcare online, and there's not going to be an endocrinologist. There's not going to be anyone there to like put any medical safeguarding in place, something you and I both agree on. Like, you will agree that those kids are still going to experiment medically. There's just not going to be a provider in the mix, right?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine some people will resort to doing extreme things for sure, but I don't think we should make our policy, you know, around the fact of what people are going to do on their own or what they might have access to. I think we need to have evidence-based policy first and foremost, and hopefully we can get those people other care that they might need so that they wouldn't maybe pursue these other avenues.
I don't know if I agree.
We need to have a grandfather clause as well.
I don't think it's like argument. Yeah. To be honest, well, I mean, not to disagree with you, Brie, but like, I mean, it's kind of like saying, you know, like, oh, well, rapists are going to rape anyway, so like, why make it illegal? Because it's like, you know, there are always going to be people who are going to go against the law or go to extreme measures to do certain things. But I get like it's different when we're talking in the aspect of healthcare, but it's like I just think this conversation kind of sucks because, you know, more kids are going to do those extreme things because we've made the whole trans topic so public and it's being discussed in schools and it's all over the media now. And I just feel like the trans visibility movement has almost harmed us more because now it's just now more kids, like I've said like a million times, it used to be a kid would like say they feel like a girl if they were a little boy, and now they're just going up to their parents or teacher and saying, oh, I'm trans, because they know what that is now, and it's like taught to them. So I don't know, I feel like it's almost just kind of like fucked us over in a way.
And Kelly, even on that, like, because these kids are hearing this rhetoric, like, you are going to kill yourself unless you transition.
Right. And I told my parents that I thought I would kill myself, when truly I don't know if I would have killed myself if I didn't go on HRT. But a huge reason my conservative parents let me go on HRT is because I told them that. And truly, if they still told me no, I don't think I would have been suicidal. I don't think I have the ability to kill myself. I just don't have
I mean, so much
of when is that.
Yeah.
It's like, is that going to like make other kids just say these things so they can get what they want? You know what I mean? Like, not like just saying you, but I'm just saying like the trans community as a whole, like pushing that. It's almost like telling kids to say these things in order to get what they want in a way.
Or telling these kids that, like, if their parents say no, then you do need to go on 4chan and like get whatever HRT you can.
Right.
So I think
I just want to clarify, I do not support going on 4chan. Just I'm just saying it's going to happen. So
because the conversation has become so elevated and so extreme, we have like, you know, if we're worried about kids going on 4chan, I think that also probably contributes to that, this feeling that like, oh my God, you know, the science is settled. If I don't start HRT, I'm dead, I'm gone. And like earlier, we were talking about kind of understanding transition retroactively. And like Kelly, I don't necessarily know if it would have been like the worst thing if I never transitioned. Like, you know, I recognize that I'm an outlier in this. I always, you know, put that on the table, but I think I probably would have been okay not transitioning, and, you know, just living as kind of like AGP man. And so, and it's like hard to acknowledge. And I think that like, if I had not transitioned, I would have always had this burning feeling of like, oh, if I just transition, everything will be like great in my life. But I think if I had like not transitioned in a hypothetical world where I also know where I end up having transitioned, and I would have been able to like sate that curiosity and just say like, okay, that's how I would feel psychologically, then I think I could probably not transition and be okay. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to like transfer information between timelines. But I do feel like so much of my transition, like, you know, candidly, Colin, you don't know this, but I transitioned, came out when I was like 14. So I transitioned very early. And a lot of the rhetoric that I was hearing from doctors was like, you know, you just need to do this and like it'll fix pretty much everything in your life. That turned out not to be the case. Now, would I say transition had like bad effects for me? No, not necessarily. Like, I would say it's overall maybe like a slight positive, but it also cost a lot. So I don't think, even in my case, I don't think it's like a clear cut, you know, positive or negative example.
Yeah, I'll raise one thing too, is that has to do with sort of the social contagion of suicide. And if you look, I think it was GLAAD and even the ACLU and other sort of the human rights campaign, they used to issue these documents of how to talk about suicide. And it used to be very clear that, don't attribute, suicide to any particular exogenous event like a legislation or something like that, because suicide is an enormously complex thing. And if people are saying that like, oh, these people committed suicide because of this one thing over here, because of the legislation, this sort of, given the social contagion of suicide, makes people more likely to commit suicide when certain laws are passed. And we have this complete flip of the narrative now, where you have HRC, you have GLAAD, who are talking specifically about like, what to do if you're feeling suicidal because of this new, law being passed. And this is just completely counter to what they're doing. And so there's a suggestion that kids who, if they're going to the black market to get, DIY HRT and stuff because they're so concerned that they're going to commit suicide, like some of that is because of, I think it was the narrative around suicide and how it's become seen as almost like a reasonable thing to do, or just like an inevitable outcome of not receiving these things. So
I fully agree with you. And I want to see the conversation. Like, I really hope I'm not coming across here as the person that's like all gas and no brakes with gender transition. Is not my intention. I fully agree with you. These stories of saying your kid's automatically going to kill themselves, utterly unhelpful. We need to stop that today. I guess it's just like, when I'm thinking about the public policy that we have to develop, it's really hard if you're saying, like, don't talk about the suicidal ideation. Like a kid getting a gun, or like Leela Alcorn throwing themselves in front of an 18-wheeler, that's not the only way that these like self-destructive tendencies exhibit themselves. It's with sexually risky behavior. I mean, how many trans women have AIDS? Colin, you've published these stories over at Reality's Last Stand. Risky sexual behavior, eating disorders, drug addiction, depression. Like a kid killing themselves is not the only way that this is expressed. And I think it's not, if I'm saying like the risk of DIY stuff, that's not to like come there and scaremonger. It's because I'm trying to ask everyone here to consider if we're going after the right target.
I'm curious, do you know, have those suicide numbers gone up? Because I just wonder if they have, like how much of it has to do with, like kids just being exposed to the idea of transition being possible. Because like, not to like reiterate my point, but I just feel like we gained so much more when people weren't aware that this was possible. And it was only something they did when they knew they had to do it. And it was last resort. So when we tell kids at like 6, 7 years old that like, oh, you can transition. This is possible for some people. Be accepting. It almost like tells them, oh, I need to do this. And it almost like makes those suicidal ideations and thoughts like come a lot more often than they are supposed to.
Mm-hmm. What do you think?
So from what I've seen, suicide rates, they've been going up across the board just in general for younger people. But this is, correlates with the general increase in mental health issues for young people. And it's really difficult to disentangle. Is it because they're identifying as trans, or do they have mental health issues before that sort of causes them to identify as trans later? It's kind of hard to know where the causal factors lie. I think there has been an increase in sort of suicidal ideation, but the actual rates of suicide, I don't think have gone up specifically, when you control for things like comorbidities and mental health issues and things like that.
But social anxiety, we know that's skyrocketing. I'm pretty sure like drug addiction rates, they are going up, across the board. So I think it would probably be reasonable to expect a lot of that is happening for trans people as well.
Yeah. It depends if it's because they're trans, or is it because of the co-occurring mental health issues. Is it just a result of mental health things, or is it? And
that's why when I got these healthcare providers there, I mean, something you've talked about a lot on Reality's Last Stand, which I had never thought about, is this tie between autism and transition. And I used to just think about this like, oh, that's just a trans girl with autism. And I today think like something fundamental, like these girls are, I don't mean this in a bad way, they're just different than I am. Like their motivations are different, their culture is different, the way they behave is different. Like I think we would be so served by like unpacking those.
Brianna trying to distinguish herself from autistic trans women is the most ridiculous thing I've heard in my entire life. This is part of her most recent iteration of herself, because the face that she's presenting, which is a bit of a double entendre here, over the past like year, is different from her footprint on the internet and how she's engaged socially in the culture for the past decade plus. And like you were saying earlier, many of her tactics are the same. She's still very much like a trans rights activist. But yes, she's had more FFS this year, and she's gotten into the HSTS LARP, where she's needs people to believe that she was an extremely effeminate gay man before she transitioned. She's been calling herself a twink now, no longer calling herself bisexual, and making comments about women's bodies online, which she was doing up until about a year ago for several years on Twitter. But so this is part of it now. But again, before this iteration of Brie on Dollcast, who has a blowout every day and has her nails done in long French tips and goes onto all of these media outlets, Brianna was an awkward, disheveled computer game programmer. Like, you are the archetype of the autistic transsexual male. So this
identified
idea
as a nerd.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Her like artifact, as the young AGP kids call it, was like literally like a gamer girl. That's why she took Gamergate as her whole thing, was like she still prides herself on this. She was saying the other day that she fought for like women's rights in the tech world, like women's employment rights in the tech world, which, like, again, like, dude, you're not a woman in the tech world, but I digress. But yeah, it's like, this is just like, she's just totally trying to reinvent herself. This idea that she can't possibly relate to these autistic trans women. Like, what? Okay.
Yeah, she found out about autogynephilia, and she has to do, as they all do, has to do everything in her power to separate herself from that. So she's exclusively attracted to men, not at all, Aspie or whatever. It's weird that she keeps talking about the Porsche collection, though.
Yeah, I know that part really is giving her away, huh?
Yes, not exactly the most feminine of financial investments.
No, it's certainly not. But yeah, I think this was interesting how, like I sort of primed earlier, how Taff and Kelly just seem to be much more conservative in how they view transgender messaging and youth intervention. And I think Kelly's sorry, go ahead.
I thought it was really impressive. Yeah, when Kelly is basically talking about, in a lot of ways, we've by making these interventions so readily available and so accessible and so known, creating a problem and an urgency in the psychology of the young people that didn't exist before. It's like, when it wasn't on offer, then, and that's actually something wise that Jamie Shoup, I think it was Jamie Shoup, who said that in a lot of ways, transition is basically the product that creates the demand. Because without it being there, it's not as, and I've said this many times for myself, is like, my gender dysphoria was pretty easy to kind of compartmentalize and live my life around, until I learned about how accessible transition was. And then suddenly all I was aware of was gender dysphoria, because I found it out. And yeah, that's essentially what Kelly is highlighting there. And I do also really appreciate her basically saying, yeah, when I was a teenager, I weaponized suicide against my parents for them to give me HRT. Like, obviously that's terrible to do, but kudos to her now for basically, owning that and saying other kids are doing this,
Yes, exactly. Brianna and Kelly went on another one of my favorite podcasts, Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em, with Nancy Rommelman and Sarah Hepola. And again, these Sarah Hepola and Nancy Rommelman, they're just like well-meaning people. Nancy met Brianna at the Free Press's election night coverage and was taken by her heart-wrenching story and moderate views on the trans issue, right? And so they have Kelly and Brianna on to kind of like cross-promote Dollcast. And Kelly said a very similar thing in the interview with Nancy and Sarah, something to the effect of like I wasn't actually suicidal. Like, I said this because I knew that's what you're supposed to say. And in that conversation, Brianna like slaps the hand pretty quickly. Like, she says like, well, you don't, I can't remember exactly what she said. We can link to the episode here for people to listen to it themselves, but something like, well, you don't really mean that, or like, but how could you really know, right? Like, easy to say because you had access to it. Maybe you would have really been suicidal. Like, she did this weird thing that she doesn't do in this conversation. And I wonder if it's because all the other people were there. There's Colin there. Like, Nancy and Sarah probably don't know very much about how skewed the suicide statistics are, right? In methodology, and in what Colin was saying, how suicidality is contagious, essentially. And so it's like easier to push back in front of them than it would have been to push back in front of Colin or Taff and Skylar for that matter. So it just like imagining how much Brianna brain must have been combusting during this conversation, because if you all recall, she's
seething.
Yeah, she sets it up by saying, well, I've got Kelly and Taff here to show you, Colin, why your evil plan to ban youth gender transition would harm and maybe even kill, right, trans people, and they just don't say that. But I did think it was interesting that in another interview that Brianna and Kelly did, like I said, that Brianna made her walk that back pretty quickly. And that interview probably has a wider circulation, more normies listening to it. The people listening to Dollcast are people who are already really tuned into this conversation and frankly, mostly like pro-trans, right? Whereas Nancy and Sarah's Heterodorx podcast is going out to more gender critical types. That's going to be their base, is like the liberals who lean on gender critical, the sort of anti-woke liberals, the heterodox, the centrist people. And so I think Brianna correctly saw that it would be more dangerous for Kelly's message to sort of eke through in that interview. And listen, Kelly is someone who has gone back and forth on a lot of things that she said. So I'm trying not to wed myself to what I perceive to be her honesty here, but it does seem like she's being honest. And I do appreciate her contributing that to the conversation because, it's important. That's a huge, not only is that like a huge threat, it's good to know that it's like literally being used dishonestly. But it's also just like, that's what gets so many parents to, like she said, that's what gets so many parents to concede and to walk their kids down this path, is because they don't want their kid to die. And it's such a serious thing that I'm glad that Brianna had this sort of thrown back in her face.
Colin, I have a question for you that is really leaning into your biology background, just because I like how you approach it with that. So I also am very similar to Taff in that I see the typology framework as useful or helpful for me. And when I made decisions about my transition, I identify with autosexual type. That's something that I have experience with, and I think was directly kind of, feeding into my gender dysphoria and what were some of the motivators for my transition. And I was not a child transitioner. I transitioned at 25. I just sort of won the genetic lottery in a way and was able to make this sort of work. And I do appreciate the fact that I had time to help come to my conclusions and my decision-making, as I feel like it's given me a lot more confidence in just kind of how to view transition as a solution for me to move forward and live a better life, and rather than like changing my sex or anything like that. And so I guess what I want to go with is when it comes to sexual orientation and sexuality, I think like what I've gained or what I've seen is that most consensus seems to be it's a process that happens in utero. But I want to hear from you about how that process, sort of how you understand it to work. And to that point, is there any sort of evolutionary advantage to experience attraction to yourself, or in my case, attraction to yourself is the opposite sex? And like, why could that happen from like an evolutionary standpoint?
Oh, that's interesting. So from what I know, the literature on the development of sexuality is something that is done in utero. I think there's also somewhat of a genetic component, but it's kind of the wiring of your brain, because there's surges of testosterone at different levels in utero that like males will experience that females won't. And we know that if you survey a bunch of people who are lesbians, you do brain scans on them, their brains are slightly more androgenized, and so which means have responded to higher levels of testosterone. They have sort of these finger digit ratios that are exemplify sort of higher levels of testosterone. Women who have polycystic ovary syndrome and their bodies are producing more levels of testosterone, they tend to be, not all of them, but they tend to be more same-sex attracted as well. So, hormone exposure does have a developmental role in who people are attracted to. It's kind of different. I think androgenization, predicts, being attracted to women, to the female body type, but it's not exactly the same with males. It's not, have a sort of feminized or non-androgenized makes you more likely to be gay, although I think it is a little bit, but it's not quite as clear cut as just like direct exposures to androgens makes people more likely to be attracted to females in development. So it appears to be an innate feature just for your sexuality that you will eventually be. It's interesting to think about whether something like AGP is its own unique sexuality that's sort of exists on the spectrum of, being straight or being gay. There might be something else going on there. I mean, I've known that there have been some brain scan studies where there's an area in the brain. I'm terrible with like names of the brain, but my friend Sam Stagg has reviewed a lot of these studies. And it's an area of the brain that has to do with like self-perception and things like that. And that tends to be larger in individuals who are like the AGP, the heterosexual, transsexual cohort.
Oh, really? That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's the same area in the brain. It's the same area in the brain that has to do with like people who are anorexic. It's sort of, they see themselves as one way, but they feel some other way. And it's really interesting. Yeah. It's kind of it's what you might expect. It's kind of like, oh, holy crap, like this makes sense in a developmental sense. As far as
it's almost like Brianna in that moment is like, should I claim AGP? Like, is that the one with the brain?
True trans.
Right, like, is that the one with the brain that actually makes you think you're the opposite sex? But that is really interesting, I think. I'd be interested to see that research. I wonder if that's the research that Blanchard commented on recently, and he said to basically, he doesn't get too excited about these things because it's like one study and limited samples, etc. But that's a pretty interesting finding, and like Colin said, it's like, oh, that makes sense. That there's sort of like this overactive part of the brain in people who are autogynephilic, or at least that there's like a high correlation there. So that is pretty interesting. And I'll just keep it paused here. I won't play the rest of Colin's response, although we'll link to this episode in the information below. But yeah, Colin basically goes on to say that like he would have to think about it. Like, what would the evolutionary reason for autogynephilia be, to being attracted to yourself? And Taftaj actually makes a few interesting sort of hypotheses or speculations too. But yeah, that's pretty satisfying that you have Kelly saying that she lied about being suicidal. You have Taftaj saying that she could have potentially lived her life as an AGP man had she been able to transfer the information that she has now as a transitioned person back to her pre-transitioned self. And then Skylar comes in saying, the source of my gender dysphoria was attraction to myself as a woman. I mean, it's like this couldn't have been more perfect for our political project, Aaron, which is truth about autogynephilia, gender dysphoria, and transition, and couldn't have worked against seemingly Brianna's project more.
Now I'm really curious, because after considering that just went so badly from her perspective, was there another episode? Like, is there more? I'm trying to look it up here. But yeah, to your knowledge, like, do you know, have there been more Dollcasts? Just because I can't imagine like they just went well against her entire agenda.
Well, I know for a fact that they have recorded episodes that haven't been published yet. So I guess we could sort of watch this space and see if they do end up going up or if this dwindles now. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this gets like scraped from the internet. I hope it doesn't. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised about that. But that's a good question. And I remember there was a pretty big gap between when they
this
publicized.
Channel doesn't have any content. Oh, wait. Nope. I was looking in the wrong place. Hold on.
Yeah, you got to go over to videos.
Okay. Yeah.
But they haven't released anything since then. They released this episode which is like the Colin portion of a larger conversation. And then they released the full episode, which this Colin portion is sandwiched in between, basically. But they haven't released any new content since this. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a lot of internal division. That's not really conducive to recording more, especially if it's just going to keep going this way. Then it doesn't serve Brianna's purpose at all.
Right.
So I can't see her continuing.
Right.
I mean,
unless her purpose is which again I don't think it is. Unless her purpose is trying to get to the truth, right, and trying to get to sanity within the trans discourse, but it doesn't seem like it is. No. It seems like she picked pretty trans women.
Yes.
Who she thinks are normal. She knows that they're not the crazy left-wing activist types. She wanted to put on this pretty, we're just girls just like you. And again, I have like sympathy for that, especially when it comes to the other people on this panel. Because like I said, I think I could hang out with them like one of the girls and have a nice time. They all seem much more steeped. Certainly Taff and Skylar seem much more steeped in reality. Again, I don't mean to slander Kelly. I just know that Kelly has had many political evolutions in a short period of time. So again, I'm just trying not to get married to this version of Kelly so that it doesn't break my heart if we lose her again.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, my conclusion here is that Dollcast is kind of based. Despite Brianna's best efforts, Dollcast is pretty based. And I hope that these conversations continue, whether it's in the format of Dollcast, or whether, some of these other trans women go on to kind of share their story in other outlets, I think that would be beneficial, because I think these are people who are, again, especially Taff and Skylar, they are really living in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And they obviously care about their fellow trans women too, you know, which again, I think frankly is more than what can be said for Brianna, because like I said at the beginning, Brianna was just tweeting today on tweeting on Twitter, on X, that she does not think that trans women with penises should be allowed into the women's room, which would exclude half of her panelists here. Yeah, so despite Brianna's best efforts to sort of shave out this hypocritical faux center path, the other trans women on Dollcast seem to have a really grounded view of what they've gotten themselves into and what the actual evidence, the evidentiary basis for this medical intervention looks like. Agreed.
And I wonder too, is this, with her saying that about being post SRS to be necessary to use the women's bathroom, I wonder if that is her way, another way of distancing herself from the self-identified AGPs, because those are the ones who haven't had SRS, right? And so again, more indication.
Sometimes
that I don't think
that's not a rule, right? There are plenty of AGPs who get
No,
you
I
mean
mean
literally the ones
in the
that
Dollcast.
Oh yes,
right.
Yeah.
Those, like, I'm wondering again. It's all evidence
stacking
up that I don't think that there's going to be another episode. If she's making this distinction, it's like, because if her and Kelly are the ones who have had SRS and they're the ones who didn't openly acknowledge being autogynephilic, Brianna can still later down the road be like, oh, they're actually, the fetishistic ones, they just happen to pass well or whatever. I don't know, but I'm just like, in her brain, she's going to keep trying to make reasons why she is a more valid womanly woman than
I agree.
Autogynephiles.
And let me give just again sort of slight benefit of the doubt, because I've spoken to, there are some really thoughtful, interesting trans women on Twitter that I speak to who kind of know Brianna behind the scenes, and they believe that she actually does have a more nuanced view about this privately and personally. They believe that she has essentially come around to the fact that AGPs might be good candidates for transition and might not be, that it both doesn't serve some of them, but also some of them, from Brianna's view, are able to assimilate nicely into womanhood. And in Brianna's view, they kind of give up the fetish, right, and become real trans women. And so, I think I think if there were to be a split, I don't think she would start calling Skylar and Taff perverts and fetishists.
Okay.
But she would still, I think this is again where it's like becomes inconsistent then when you try to actually form policy around this, because so if they're not perverts and fetishists and they're also well assimilated trans women, then why, then are you comfortable drawing the line on whether they've had vaginoplasty or not?
Right.
And I don't think she'd be willing to draw that line to their face.
No, but we've seen this a lot with other auto heterosexuals trying to cope. Is their lines change on the daily based on whatever is kind of self-soothing, not necessarily even strategic or anything. It's just what's going to make me feel better right now and make me feel valid. And so I think she definitely falls into that category, because she's been making so many missteps about I would kill myself if I didn't have access to HRT. It's like, no one you're trying to appeal to is really actually sympathetic to that. She just falls into the into the histrionics when
right. In fact, a lot of people are very resentful of that, of that type of emotional manipulation.
People are rightly over it. But I agree with you. Dollcast is based. Brianna Wu definitely not based. But
with that said, first of all, we would have all of them here to talk. That includes Brianna Wu. I don't know that she'd be taking our invitation at this point, because we've talked a lot of smack. But if she really is open to crossing political divides and trying to, you know, gain support for her message, we would be good people to talk to. We don't hate trans people. We're not the evil TERFs that she talks about. And we share a lot of frustrations with those extreme GC activists. So yeah, but you know, Taff, Skylar, Kelly,
especially
you guys want to come on?
Yeah.
Yes, right. Especially the self-identified autogynephiles.
That's what we do here.
That's what we do here. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks all.